David K. Johnston, a book called The Making of Donald Trump is your latest, and you say in the book that in the spring of 2016 you talked to Mr. Trump on the phone. What was that about?
Well, I was writing a piece for Politico magazine about all of Donald's connections to a very major drug trafficker who supplied him with his helicopters, to con artists, swindlers, American mafia, Russian mobsters, and Donald had been sent an email by me asking if he wanted to comment with about 20 points, and he called me. And the essence of the conversation was, you know, you've written a lot of things I like, Dave, but if I don't like what you write, I'm going to sue you. From covering the Santa Cruz City Council in California 50 years ago to today, that's the only politician who's ever threatened to sue me unless I write what he wants. And I said, well, Donald, you're a public figure. That means he would have to prove I deliberately lied and knew it. And he goes, I know I'm a public figure, I'll sue you anyway. And I think this is indicative of Donald's character and his authoritarian approach. You do it the way I want it, or I will make life difficult for you.
What do you remember reacting to when he said that? What was your...
People threaten to sue me a lot of times. It just goes with the job.
1988 in Atlantic City, you say you've met him for the first time. What were the circumstances?
Well, I had left the Los Angeles Times, where I'd spent 12 years, to go to Atlantic City for the Philadelphia Inquirer. I believed we were going to see casino gaming spread all across America, which it did, and I wanted to examine whether government really could clean up this business that was traditionally run by vice lords and crooks. And within a couple of days, I met Donald. I immediately recognized, Brian, that he's P.T. Barnum. He's selling you tickets to the Fiji Mermaid and the Amazing Two-Headed Woman. And then I started, because he was the dominant force in Atlantic City, I started asking about him and his competitors, including Steve Wynn, and people who worked for him, and some big gamblers, all said to me, Donald doesn't know anything about the casino business. Oh, come on. How can he not know anything about the casino business? They said that all he knows is how to extract money from the casino. He doesn't know how to manage customers. He doesn't know how to reinvest in the properties. He doesn't know how to develop customers, etc. So Donald and I had a cup of coffee not long after that, and I asked him a question about craps. And I deliberately made a false statement. And Donald immediately incorporated my falsehood into his answer. Well, that's what con artists do. That's what the psychics advertised on daytime TV do. So I had a couple more questions that I asked him where I made false statements, and he immediately embraced them. And I realized that what I was being told was true. Donald doesn't know anything. It's all bluster. It's all appearance. It's all threats. He's quick. And he's smart, but he's not at all studious or deep. And in the book, I quote testimony where he gives answers to questions. One of them, my students at Syracuse University, who are law, third-year law, and graduate business students, at the end of my course can answer the question like this. Anyone who's been to the Wharton Business School can answer like this. Donald's answer is gibberish. He doesn't understand the most basic issues of finance. And listen to how he answers questions. You know, he'll go, oh, you ask him, what's your favorite Bible verse? Because he says, no one reads the Bible more than Donald Trump. And he goes, there's so many, you know, there's just so many.
Back in 1968, he appeared on the Oprah show.
In 88, I think. 68?
I say 68, that just shows you my age. Back in 88. 28 years ago, what do you think?
Well, first of all, that was the year he asked George H.W. Bush to make him his running mate as vice president, and instead Dan Quayle got the job. Donald has been talking about running for president since 1985. And 12 years later, in 2000, he ran, and he said, I'm going to be the first person to run for president and make a profit. So this is indicative of Donald. Donald will tell you whatever he thinks is in his interest at the moment. That's what con artists do. They tell you whatever's in their interest, whatever they think you want to hear, and what will get you to do whatever it is they want.
What are your own politics?
Well, I'm a registered Republican. Before that, I was registered in Tom Golisano's party in New York, but I'm not a political person. I voted for people on every line that's ever appeared on a ballot I'm on for different offices. I don't like politics. This is one of only 2 campaigns in the last 40 years I've covered. I did, for the LA Times, the governor's race in 1976 in Nevada, and hated covering it. I don't like covering politics. I'm a policy guy. I am someone who believes that we should be using the government for the purposes, the 6 noble purposes in the preamble, to establish justice, promote the general welfare, And in fact, I'm developing, I hope, a new course to teach at Syracuse, which is how we got the Constitution and what it's about in context.
You say in the book that the Trump family really haven't been voters.
Yes. Interestingly, 2 of Donald's children did not get to vote for him because they hadn't registered as Republicans, and they then complained about the rules. Well, New York has archaic, awful, terrible election rules, but they should have known this. And they're the ones who are responsible for doing this. Donald hasn't voted in a bunch of elections. And by the way, Donald, until very recently, was basically a Democrat. And one of the things Donald believes in, which is a good thing in my view, is universal health care. We should get health care off the backs of business, and it should be, as he says, a public good provided to everybody. That's certainly not a Republican Party position.
Give us some background on yourself. Where did you grow up?
I was born in San Francisco. I consider home to be Santa Cruz, California. My father was a 100% disabled veteran of World War II. My mother was a disowned heiress, and I had the odd experience of growing up in a house on a cliff over the beach that my parents rented for maybe $400 a month in today's money, nothing.
What do you mean by disowned heiress?
She testified against her father in a lawsuit in 1941 when he was sued for alienation of affection, and his only child, my mother, was disowned. And he was a very wealthy man. And so I went to work when I was 10 years old. I went to work full-time at 13. I became a reporter for some weekly papers at 17, and my work immediately got noticed because I did some simple things. If the school board said, the owner of the average $34,314 house in Santa Cruz next year will pay $42.11 more in property taxes, I thought that was useless. So with long division, I said, you'll pay so much more per thousand in the value of your house. At 18, the San Jose Mercury recruited me. At 19, I was writing front page stories in the San Jose Mercury as a staff writer, and I went to the University of Chicago Graduate School of Economics as a fellow for 2 quarters, to the Detroit Free Press, the LA Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, the New York Times, and then just short of 40 years of daily reporting, I left, and since then I've been a columnist and an author and teaching at Syracuse University in the College of Law.
But live in Rochester.
Live in Rochester. My wife runs the very successful community foundation there, and in Rochester, New York, we have the best child care in all of the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, and it costs this much more than warehousing kids. Very smart program that she's intimately involved in.
A couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump went to Tampa to give a speech, and when he got there, this video, which was not done by him, of course, it was done by the folks that are opposed to him, played. It's about 50 seconds. See what you think. So, what's that all about?
Well, Donald Trump had someone come to him with what was a very good business idea. The man was in the business of running continuing professional education. Lawyers, accountants, real estate agents have to go to courses to make sure they're up on the law. And he went to Trump and said, hey, why don't we do Trump real estate professional education? We charge a premium price. Well, that's a brilliant business idea. And Donald said, that's such a good idea, I'm taking it away from you. He gave the guy a little tiny stake, I think it was 3% and a $250,000 salary, and they decided then to turn it into Trump University. Well, first of all, you can't call something a university without a license from the state. And that's true in, I believe, every state in the union, but every state I've checked it is. Secondly, this was not a university in even the dictionary meaning of the word. And Trump University quickly came under investigation as a scam. People paid $1,500, and what they got for that were high-pressure sales tactics where the faculty would stand over them and tell them how to call banks and borrow more money on credit cards so they could pay $35,000 to get the full Trump University package. Donald did a promotional video. Trump University is all about success. You're going to have success. We're going to have the best faculty and adjunct faculty. They will be hand-picked by me, the best of the very best. You'll get a better education than at the best business schools, and I know because I went to the best one. He didn't, by the way. He went to the undergraduate program at Wharton, not its graduate program. Well, it turned out that the faculty knew nothing about real estate. They included the manager of a fast food joint, 2 people in personal bankruptcy, and a lot of people with experience, Brian, in high-pressure sales tactics, as with getting people to run up their debts. And by the way, if you've run up your debt and borrowed as much as the banks will possibly give you to pay for the Trump University, how would you have any borrowing capacity to buy real estate? So the New York State Attorney General brought a lawsuit over this. Donald was told to stop using the word university. He ignored it for several years. The Texas Attorney General's office did an investigation, and Pam Bondi, the Attorney General of Florida, said publicly she was thinking about joining the New York investigation. She and Donald had some kind of communication. They also, the Donald J. Trump Charitable Foundation then made a campaign contribution to Pam Bondi. Now, charitable foundations cannot be involved in political activity. This should cause the revocation of their status as a nonprofit. The Bondi campaign manager was asked about this, and the Florida newspapers reported that we're perfectly comfortable with the gift from the Donald J. Trump Foundation, which is astonishing. Pam Bondi's a lawyer. She knows better than this. She also decided not to participate in the New York Attorney General's investigation. And this ad, which is pretty brutal, is about fundamentally Pam Bondi. It's about the Attorney General who accepted this gift. And by the way, the Trump people tried to cover this up. They argued, and I explained in my book, that it was money to go to a particular group, an anti-abortion group that teaches people how to protest against our current abortion laws. They didn't get any money. Then they said it was this outfit in California. They didn't get any money. And they said, well, it was just a mistake. Well, if it's a mistake, Pam Bondi should have given it back, and they should have directed the money to other organizations. They haven't done any of that. And it goes to a core issue about Donald. Donald has no regard for whatever the law is. He does what he wants to do.
Has he ever been sued?
Oh, he's been sued, according to USA Today, more than 4,500 times. He's been sued by workers he wouldn't pay, and there's a chapter in my book about that. He's been sued by vendors, and he's been sued by investors who say they've been swindled. Right now, and this happened after I finished the book, a Benjamin Moore paint dealer who supplied paint for the remake of the Doral Country Club that Donald owns, wasn't paid the last $34,000. And do a little business like that, $34,000, a big hunk of their year's profits. He sued. He spent over $300,000 on legal fees trying to collect his $34,000. And a judge finally granted this Benjamin Moore paint dealer the power to foreclose on the Doral after Donald Trump's witness testified about, why didn't you pay the $34,000? Your contract said you had to pay. Mr. Trump feels he has paid enough. And Donald does this all the time. He'll take the work you do for him, he'll use it, and then he'll say, I'm not going to use it, it's crap. I'm not going to pay you for it. And if you go to a lawyer and it's $34,000 or even $100,000, they'll tell you, you're going to spend $300,000 on lawyers to fight Trump? And he's done this again and again and again and again and again.
This book was published by what publisher?
Melville House Press, which is a little outfit in Brooklyn and in London that do something, when I did my very first book, which you interviewed me about, Temples of Chance, back in 1992, I complained back then that my publisher was doing everything on paper and they were slow and they're efficient. I said, somebody needs to make this modern and quick and modernize the book business. These folks did it.
Wikipedia says it's a liberal publishing operation.
Liberal, conservative, I don't care. I mean, I don't pay any attention to the politics of the people I work for. When I was at the LA Times, they ran editorials sometimes that basically said, don't believe what that guy wrote. I don't care. I tell the people I'm writing for what I'm going to write, even when I was a reporter. They never tell me, unless, if it's breaking news, airplane crash, we need you to be the rewrite man. And I would do that. I tell them what I'm going to do, and I've always done that. And if you do that, of course, eventually you wear out your welcome wherever you work.
Where did you get the idea to do this book, and when?
Well, Temples of Chance, I think all but one chapter has some reference to Trump in it, because he was so dominant in Atlantic City. When Donald announced on June 16th, 2015, he was running, I got a hold of my literary agent right away and said, we should do a book. She called around and everybody said, he's not going to get the nomination. And I said, yes, he might get the nomination. He's serious this time. And I was particularly charged up by the fact that here he is giving this speech talking about murderers and rapists from Mexico, denouncing Muslims, and there are all these young people applauding these lines. And I thought, Midtown Manhattan is not a place known for racism and xenophobia. What did he do? Are these employees, or did he bus people in? Where did he get this crowd? Well, a day or two later, the Hollywood Reporter revealed that they were actors paid $50 each to show up and applaud on cue, which tells you what a fraud Donald Trump is. And anyhow, nobody wanted to do a book. by the time it became clear he might get the nomination, for traditional publishers who need about a year, it was too late. And I had just given up on the idea. I wrote about 25 pieces about Donald for USA Today, Newsweek, National Memo, some other places. Many of them aimed at reporters, trying to say, this is what you should be asking, this is what you should be questioning. And then Melville House calls out of the blue, and they asked, could we do the book in, I think it was 3 weeks? And I said no, but I said I can do it by a date that was 4 weeks later. I wrote that book in 27 days. It was hell, and I'm frankly not sure I've physically recovered at my age from doing it. I'm certainly never going to do it again, but 27 days.
Because we're in the middle of the campaign, 27 days, it was finished. What day was that?
Well, my closing note, the epilogue, is dated the 4th of July. I actually finished the book the 5th of July. We finished editing it the 10th of July, and there's a picture on my Facebook page of me sitting in my garden reading the book on the 19th of July, 2 weeks later, and it went on sale August 2nd, 2 weeks after that. And the German language edition went on sale August 30th. They had to translate into German.
So lawyers. And by the way, you called him on this program already a con man and a fraud. How concerned was the publisher that they pull the lawyers in on this?
Well, sure. This was vetted by a lawyer, and one of the things I don't do in this book is I don't break new ground in it, because I knew we had to get it lawyered quickly. So what I've done here is connected the dots and pulled together my work, the great Wayne Barrett's work, probably the best reporter who ever worked in New York City, pieces elsewhere, and I have this enormous collection of Trump documents. I used to have to rent 2 storage lockers to hold my files on Donald Trump, Barron Hilton, the LAPD, Jack Welch, and some other people, and now I've mostly got them digitized. But I had all these files, and so one of my grown children would sit in the other room. She created the files so they were logical for me, and after I was done with them and there's a mess, she would put everything back in order and put it away so we could get back to it when we needed it. And the lawyer, I don't think the lawyer on this book changed more than 10 words. And I know that several times when he got to a paragraph, he went, oh, yep, wrong verb, fix that right now.
Do you have any worries? Do you have to have an insurance policy to protect you?
Well, the publisher has an insurance policy. If Donald's going to sue me, he's going to sue me. I was actually surprised Donald said that to me, because we've known each other. He knows I don't intimidate. He's tried to intimidate me in the past. I mean, I'm a guy who hunted down an especially vicious murderer in a black-on-white murder. I've run into a burning building. I mean, maybe I have a screw loose somewhere that I don't have a fear factor.
By the way?
In Mountain View, California.
Why did you do that?
Get a better picture. I also ran towards 2 buildings people were in, but they got out of them before I got there, thank goodness. But, you know, you do what you need to do in your job, and my job is to tell people facts they wouldn't know but for my work. So, you know, I've been tailed by the LAPD, by the government in Taiwan, or people connected with it. I've had lots of people threaten me. You know, it's my job, and you do what you need to do, or you don't do the kind of work that I do. So anyway, the lawyer changed very little in this book. On contrast to that, I wrote a piece for Politico magazine, that's what Donald called me about, which had nothing new in it. It simply pointed out a number, not all of them, of his connections to criminals, his business dealings with them, and his gratuitous connections with them. That is the most heavily lawyered piece of my career, with maybe one exception. And I've written stories accusing people of murder. You know, Jack Welch gave up his retirement benefits over a story I wrote. And that lawyering told me that he's really been intimidating news organizations and threatening to sue them. And while they know that he can't win, he can cost them a lot of money.
The former CEO of GE, Jack Welch, did what that he gave up his retirement benefits?
Jack Welch had a retirement package that was described to the investors only as Mr. Welch shall continue to receive those emoluments he had while serving the company. Then he left his wife, and she, a litigator, put into the public record enough information that I was able to show that he was going to get what I estimate to be about $70 million of the use of a GE jet, apartments, ball game tickets and stuff, whether he used them or not. And I laid out the economics in particular of the corporate jet. And Welch then wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal relinquishing all of this and saying that some people who don't respect contracts, I respect his contract, I just thought investors should know what they were actually paying Jack Welch. And I know from something he said to another journalist that he's furious at the mention of my name. He's entitled. I cost him a lot of money.
back to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
In the book, you talk about an outfit called Awards, or the Academy of Hospitality Services.
Yes.
The Academy of Hospitality Services.
Or Sciences, I think. This is an organization run by a convicted art thief and mob associate known as Joey Two Socks, Joseph Sink. And it hands out what it says is the most prestigious award in the world. Not the most prestigious travel industry award, the most prestigious award in the world. It's the 5-Diamond Award and the 6-Diamond Award. And at least 19 Trump properties have these awards on big, huge plaques on the wall. And they're signed by Joey Two Socks, and they're also signed by the chairman of the board of the Academy, Donald J. Trump. Donald Trump gives awards to himself. And there are video on the internet you can see of this. I mean, this is absurd, giving an award to yourself.
It works.
Well, apparently a lot of people think these are fabulous properties. I point out that a couple of his golf courses have awards, and yet if you look at the Golf Digest or Golf Magazine, I forget which one listed the 100 best golf courses, no Trump golf courses on that list.
What's he do well?
Well, first and foremost, Donald is masterful at making himself a household name. I mean, you've been on television for years. You're not a household name, Brian, and neither am I. But Donald is a household name. I mean, that's quite an accomplishment. He, secondly, has created this image of himself as the modern Midas, that everything he touches turns to gold, when in fact a lot of it turns to dross, and the only person who ends up with any gold is Donald. He also has been successful in getting even network television in America to run stories that, in essence, he is the Don Juan of our age, and that women like Madonna and Kim Basinger and Carla Bruni are pounding on his bedroom door. By the way, he doesn't even know two of them. The third one says he's the king of sleaze and had nothing to do with him. She's talked to him apparently twice in her life.
Carla Bruni, who is married to Sarkozy of France.
Right. And when she became the First Lady of France, Donald had the opportunity, when he was on the Howard Stern show, as I report in The Making of Donald Trump, to back away from these imaginary lover stories that he planted, and he didn't. But he's very good at planting these stories so that people have an image of him that has nothing to do, I think, with the reality of who he is. His building of Trump Tower, that's quite a building. It's a significant accomplishment.
Where is it?
It's on 5th Avenue in Manhattan, right in the middle of the city. Now, it's 58 stories. He tells everybody it's 68. That's part of how Donald exaggerates things. Those are things that I think he's accomplished and done very well. But his companies are very poorly managed. Fortune magazine looked at his casino company when it was a public company and concluded that of the 496 companies they studied, Donald came in dead last or almost last in every single category. This is no surprise to people who've worked for Donald and competitors. So that's another area where he's great at creating this image of himself that doesn't comport with reality.
Go back to the Carla Bruni story. What's the rest of it? How did he get in the middle of this?
Well, when Donald was divorcing his first wife, Ivana, he went out of his way to publicly humiliate the mother of his children. He planted all sorts of news stories that there was a competition going on and that Madonna and Kim Basinger and Carla Bruni and other women were trying to become the next Mrs. Trump. And he used a PR man named John Barron. John Barron was Donald Trump. He called up these news organizations, and they didn't know who he was. He wasn't as well known at the time, to pose as this PR man promoting Trump. And People magazine outed him at the time.
We've got a clip. Sue Carswell is the woman that wrote the piece in People, and that was back in 1991.
90 or 91, yes. Yeah, 91.
So when we're listening to this, and there'll be language on the screen, that is Donald Trump masquerading as either John Barron or John Miller.
Absolutely, that's Donald, and they outed him in a story where they made fun of him. Because here's a middle-aged man acting like a 13-year-old boy talking about some girl he was with. It's just extraordinary.
Here's just a little bit of this. It starts off slow, but you'll be able to hear it right away. It was going by the name of John Miller. Did she know that was Donald Trump?
Well, she figured it out very quickly. She had not covered him, but he displayed such intimate conversation for the freshly hired PR person and talked in such detail that it was clear it was Donald Trump. And People magazine ran this piece saying something like, there are odd stories, there are unusual stories, there are funny stories, and then there's this really bizarre story.
How long did he do that, go under the name?
For years. For years. He did that with the USFL. He would call up journalists and plant plant a store.
What's USFL?
The United States Football League. That was the spring football league, which I point out in the book he basically destroyed with a litigation strategy instead of a market strategy. And he would call up news organizations, sometimes to different reporters, and he would be John Barron or John Miller, and then he would call as himself and verify the story to get it planted. He did this. He got a story planted that way in the New York Times about the USFL, the Football League. He also used it to menace, to threaten people with litigation if they didn't back off. In particular, there were about 150 to 200 illegal immigrants from Poland who were demolishing the Bonwit Teller department store, where the site, which is now Trump Tower. They were being paid $4 an hour. They slept on the site in the middle of winter because they had nowhere else to go. They didn't have hard hats or goggles or any safety equipment, and then they didn't get paid until they threatened to hang Donald's overseer off the side of the building because they hadn't gotten paid. And Donald was later found by a federal judge to have engaged in a conspiracy to cheat the workers out of their money. $4 an hour, and he's not paying people.
Bulgari.
Yes.
What is it, and what's the story?
Well, Bulgari is a high-end Italian jewelry company with stores all over the world, including across the street from Trump Tower. And Donald Trump engaged in something known as the empty box scam. He bought a $50,000 piece of jewelry and then a $15,000 piece, and he had them shipped out of state. That, if they were shipped out of state to a non-resident of New York, there would be no sales tax due. There might be a use tax due in that state, but that's not enforced very much. And Donald was not eligible for this because he lived in New York. He lived right across the street. When law enforcement got onto this and the New York Attorney General, Robert Abrams, began investigating, Donald got wind of this. Now, he had a casino license, and his involvement in any crime would vitiate his license. So Donald went to law enforcement to help them. And he wasn't the only one involved. Mary Tyler Moore, Henry Kissinger were involved in this. It's a scam that's gone on for decades. It continues to go on. There's a case right now about this.
Did those people know it was illegal doing
what they were doing? Of course they did. Of course they did. And the Bulgari was so cheap in doing this that instead of paying the postage for what the weight would be of the jewelry, they saved a little bit of money by sending empty boxes with no weight. But the significance of the story is it's clear evidence of Donald participating in tax cheating, and that should have cost him his casino license had the state of New Jersey had any interest in tightening up and enforcing the law that required Donald and all other casino owners to prove by clear and convincing evidence that they are morally fit, they're honest, they don't associate with criminals.
So if you were with some of your friends and Donald Trump was elected president and you're sitting around talking and all of a sudden you look up on the screen and the winner is Donald Trump, what's the first thing you'd say to him?
I'd say, well, how long until we have a constitutional crisis? Donald does not understand the powers, limits, and duties of our president under the Constitution. He talks like the president is a dictator. He has said he will order our military to engage in illegal acts. And if you're a senior United States military officer, my guess is you are reading up very carefully on how you refuse an unlawful order from the commander-in-chief, in order to use nuclear weapons in Europe, where our friends are, which Donald has talked about, in order to torture people. We executed Japanese soldiers after World War II for waterboarding. And that would be the big concern. The second one would be, if Donald is president of the United States, I'm absolutely certain that I will have trouble with somebody in federal law enforcement. He will find some way to make my life difficult, because that's who Donald is. Donald's philosophy, which he's written about at great length and spoken about and lectured about and been interviewed about, is get revenge. Destroy anybody. If someone just won't do you a favor, destroy their life and take pleasure in that. That should make you really, really happy. He says when he destroys people's lives, it just makes him so happy. So if he gets elected, I'm going to have trouble.
What would you say to this same group if Hillary Clinton's elected?
I haven't thought a lot about that. I mean, Hillary Clinton, like John Kasich, is competent to be president. She knows what the job is and how to do it. I don't see any indication she's going to pursue policies that are inimical to the long-term interests of the country. I don't like a lot of her policies, but
you've been an investigative reporter,
yeah.
And you must have looked at what's going on with the foundation and all.
No, and the reason is I can't do everything. I don't know Hillary Clinton. When I left the LA Times, if I had gone to Little Rock, I'd be writing a book about Hillary Clinton. There's a lot there. I went to Atlantic City and I met Donald Trump. There are good books about Hillary Clinton, well-written books. There's also some garbage on both of them, but there's some well-written books, and I encourage people in my book to go read those books. I've written about Hillary Clinton twice in my life. I've never spoken to her or anybody on her staff. In 1997 in the New York Times, I pointed out that the Clintons paid more than twice as much federal income tax as the law required, despite spending almost $9,000 or $10,000 a year having their tax returns prepared. And it was because she mishandled as a tax matter the royalties from her book, It Takes a Village. She said she'd give them all away. Well, she took them as income, paid the taxes, and gave away the difference. She was furious about this. She went absolutely nuts about it. The New York Times actually didn't publish my story the first year, so I had to wait a year and redo it after I had some editors lined up about it. And then the next year, I went to the White House to get the president's tax returns, and I said, there's nothing here about the new book. What is it? And I think Jody Enda from Knight Ridder hollered out, "Letters to Buddy and Socks." And I go, "Yeah, about the pets." And the spokesman says, well, the Clintons gave the copyright to a public charity, which was the implicit advice in my story. And I said, "Oh, really?" And the spokesman said, "Yes, and the White House wants to be on record that the Clintons did not take their advice from the New York Times," at which point everybody erupted in laughter, because they obviously did that. And it meant more money for charity and less for the government.
How many years were you with the New York Times? What was your beat, and when did you leave it?
I was with the New York Times for 13 years. I left in April of 2008. I came there to show that we could cover taxes in a different way and examine how the system actually works as opposed to what politicians and others say about it, which is why I did it out of New York and my home in Rochester, New York, not Washington. I also changed the way all journalists cover executive compensation by showing things that were right in front of us that we weren't paying attention to. And but principally, I did taxes, and as measured by Congress, my work resulted in over $250 billion of tax dodges being stopped. And a lot of people went to prison.
What was the biggest?
Well, the biggest was President Bush had in his tax plan that he wouldn't show us before the election a stealth provision that would allow
Which president, by the way?
President George W. Bush.
Okay.
In his tax plan, there was what I call a stealth provision, because he wouldn't show us the plan before the election, that would repeal the gift tax. And that was an idea that conservative Republicans put into the law in the 1920s. And when the White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer was asked about this, he expressed that, I knew my stuff about taxes, and then they quietly withdrew this provision that Congress later, staff report showed it would have cost just in the first 10 years about $250 billion. And there was the Bermuda mailbox scam and a lot of other. Professor Schmalbach, who teaches tax law at Duke, has called me the de facto chief tax enforcement officer of the United States.
And you told me just before we started, you got a book you're planning on taxes?
Yes, the book I was working on when I dropped for this is tentatively called The Prosperity Tax, an entirely new federal tax code for the 21st century economy. We have a really great tax system in America for 1960. And we no longer live in the industrial age, but we have an industrial age tax system. And we need to have a tax system for the current economy. And this book will have the actual statutory language. I'm not a lawyer, but I've learned how to write statutory language. And I expect it to be less than 100 pages. And it uses things that are all in the law already. There's only one thing I have in there that's not already in the law. It's much simpler. Very few people will have to file a tax return. Nobody has to. There's a group that can choose to. Corporations will have a much easier time. It'll be much more efficient. We can shrink the IRS down. And I've set up a mechanism by which if you want to cheat on your taxes, you have to engage in a criminal conspiracy with the other person. The other person is liable for the taxes, and you're both going to go to prison.
What's the publishing time for this?
Well, I'm not teaching this year, so I can finish it. So I'm hoping the book will be out in 2018.
Speaking of tax, how much tax has Donald Trump paid, from what you know?
Well, we know, as a matter of fact, that he paid no income taxes in 78, 79, 84, 92, and 94. We know that in recent years, his adjusted gross income, that's the last line on the front page of your tax return, was less than $500,000. Now, the tax law has all sorts of provisions that allow some people at the top to live tax-free or virtually tax-free. private equity managers like Mitt Romney, hedge fund managers, and people who are full-time real estate professionals like Donald Trump. There is good reason to believe, because of those rules, that Donald probably has paid no income taxes, or maybe a couple of years, a little bit, since 1978.
And do you think he will
release his returns?
Yes.
Never, not a chance. It is never going to happen. And when Donald and his son say, there's nothing there, you couldn't tell anything from the tax returns, you give me Donald Trump's complete tax return for 1 year, and I'll back engineer and tell you the value of his hard assets. I'll tell you where his income sources are. I'll tell you a lot about him.
You mentioned earlier about Donald Trump's religion, excuse me, and also his Bible reading. Here's Jerry Falwell Jr., who spoke at the convention this year on his behalf and has been supporting him. Yeah?
Well, I've known and spent time with mobsters who were good family men. I mean, that part doesn't impress me. What troubles me are the pastors who are saying that Donald Trump is a good Christian man. Donald Trump, in his own words, is aggressively antithetical to Christianity. First of all, he denigrates communion. Well, you get your little water and your little cracker. When he's asked, as he's been many times, to cite a favorite passage from the Bible, because he says nobody reads the Bible more than Donald Trump, he gives a con man answer. Well, there's just so many. And the one time he tried, which I recount in the book, he got it wrong, and he was out of Leviticus, an eye for an eye, and he didn't even understand what that concept actually means. I'm sorry, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, especially Matthew 5:39 to 45, Jesus' message was, you turn the other cheek, you are kind to other people. Donald rejects that. He says of people who do that, you're fools, you're idiots, you're schmucks. And he didn't just do it in passing. This is not a gaffe. This is a well-established record. So to the pastors who are endorsing Donald Trump, if they want to endorse him and say, look, he's better than the other person, I don't have any problem with that. That makes perfect sense. But do not deceive your flocks. Do not allow this man to beguile you with flattery. Do not tell people this falsehood. And I've emailed a couple of them and offered my book and a short description of what's there. Only one got back to me through an assistant to basically say, well, thanks. If we want to know anything, we'll get in touch with you. Ministers have an absolute duty not to deceive their flocks and not to tell them that a man whose own lengthy statements and actions are aggressively anti the message of Jesus Christ is a good Christian man, and to vote for him for that reason. That's an awful development, and I want these pastors called to account. The members of their flocks and other religious leaders should be raising Cain about this.
Do you have any sense of why Jerry Falwell Jr. is supporting me? They have the largest, I believe, Christian university in the United States with their online service.
Well, I hope it's because he's badly informed. That's my hope. My concern is that he's more interested in political outcomes than he is in following the message of Jesus Christ.
You have a story in your book about a man named Satter, S-A-T-T-E-R. Excuse me, Sater. S-A-T-T-E-R, but you say sometimes his name was spelled S-A-T-E-R.
Felix Sater is the son of the reputed Russian mob boss, who, by the way, has threatened now twice to sue me over writing about him. He was Donald Trump's senior advisor. He had a business card, senior advisor to Donald Trump. His office was right in the main suite of Trump Organization offices in Trump Tower. He and Donald traveled all over together, Loveland, Colorado, Denver, Phoenix, Fort Lauderdale, New York. They were involved in putting building projects together. Felix Sater is a defendant in a private attorney general action in the state of New York, accusing him of running a $250 million tax fraud. It's only an accusation. It is a tax fraud that could not have taken place but for a letter that Donald Trump signed that authorized changes that made it possible. And this tax fraud goes through Icelandic banks to Russian oligarchs. And Felix Sater is a convicted violent felon. He put the broken end of a margarita stem glass so deeply into a man's face, it took 110 stitches and his face will never be right. And he's a convicted stock swindler. With the help of 4 mob families in New York, he ran a $40 million stock scam that he's pled guilty to. Donald is not supposed to be, when he had a casino, associating with these folks. Secondly, they're borrowing money from banks, and they hid this. The reason Felix Sater sometimes put an extra T in his name was so journalists and others wouldn't find out about his background. Donald Trump had a duty to investors and to bankers he borrowed from to inquire into this man's background. He didn't, or he didn't want to. And he has told, I think it was the AP, Jason Horowitz has been doing a very good job at the AP, I think was the one he said this to. He said, I hardly know the man. If he was in the room, I wouldn't recognize him. I've got video and photographs and interviews they did together. I mean, that's absurd. He knows this guy very, very well. And this is part of these not fully developed understanding we have of Donald's connection to the Putin regime and to the Russian oligarchs. That should be very much the subject of a lot of inquiry by my peers. They should be deeply digging into what is it that Donald Trump is advancing the primary foreign policy objective of Vladimir Putin, weaken NATO. He won't say a single critical word about him. He's been paid millions of dollars by Russian oligarchs. He's boasted, I had every one of them in a room in Moscow, I think this was 8 years ago. He's tried to do all sorts of deals in Russia. There's a 47-story building in one of the former Soviet Empire countries with his name on it. And there is this alleged tax fraud. And Sater is at the center of all of this. What is Donald Trump doing, spending years in very close relationship with this convicted violent felon and stock swindler? And there are a bunch of lawsuits about it, including hiding this man's criminal background from investors that damage their interests as a result.
What marks would you give your peers that you mentioned?
Well, overall, I think the American news media has done an awful job. Now, I know some people listening to this are immediately saying, well, nobody vetted Barack Obama. Actually, they did. You just have to go look and read the news about it. I mean, I know about women he dated and kids he went to grammar school with and high school with, and lots about Barack Obama. What his professors said about him and fellow students at Columbia and at Harvard, where he was incredibly highly regarded. Just as an example of this. In Donald Trump's case, you're only now starting to see an inquiry into him. Now, the Washington Post had about 20 reporters on this, and I helped them with some things. I gave them documents and stuff, as I often do for other reporters. Which most journalists don't do, but I do. And they've done some pretty good stories, but they're written in the way that highbrow newspapers now do this, so that unless you're a sophisticated reader, you don't get the point. The Wall Street Journal has done nothing of any consequence. The New York Times has recently done some very good stories, but the same thing, they're written in this very highbrow fashion that you can easily not grasp what's going on.
What about television?
Absolutely appalling. Brian, I've been on the national networks, broadcast networks in Australia, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, repeatedly. I haven't been on a single U.S. broadcast network, none of the Sunday morning talk shows. They've had people on who don't know anything, talking about things about Donald Trump and speculating when I could give them hard facts from the public record.
Why do you think they're doing that?
Well, first of all, and most importantly, Donald Trump is great television. I mean, you can't turn it off. And Fox News has said, that when they turn off, or one of their agents has said, when they turn off Donald Trump, people turn their TVs off. It's like not just watching a car wreck, it's like watching this incredible car wreck. And so people want to see it. So there's a commercial interest. Secondly, newsrooms have been shrunk enormously. I mean, basically the fastest disappearing white-collar job in America in the last 15 years has been journalist. And the resources aren't there. I mean, I once spent $10,000 of the Los Angeles Times' money on one paragraph. Today, to get $10,000 to do a story, you'd have to really convince editors there was something substantial there. And then, I think more importantly, the duty of journalists, which is to tell you that which people don't want to tell you, has been in decline because of all the attacks from people who don't want to hear things, and they mount attacks. And both the left and the right about this.
Here's his dad. This is 1985, getting the Horatio Alger Award in New York.
I don't remember reading that in Shakespeare. Maybe that's there. But Fred Trump was an incredibly industrious guy. He was really hardworking. But he also was a guy who profiteered on GI housing after the war. And President Eisenhower, when he found out that Fred Trump had $4 million of excess profits, threw a fit in the White House. And the proof of that is 100 federal investigators are put on Fred Trump and a few other developers. And when he was hauled before the Senate Finance Committee, you know, and this is indicative of the future under Donald Trump, he said, well, this is all just a misunderstanding. I didn't profiteer. I haven't taken any money. Yes, I have $4 million more, but it's in the bank. I didn't take it, so I'm not a profiteer. And Fred Trump, honest? Well, let's see. They color-coded applications for rentals, so when a black or Puerto Rican renter would show up with solid finances to rent an apartment, they would be steered to a building for blacks or Puerto Ricans. They would be steered away from Beach Haven. And I had the lyrics to a song about Fred Trump's racism by Woody Guthrie because of the generosity of the Guthrie family in the book. And he was well known for his association with the mob guys through Willie Tomasello, his partner, who was a mob associate.
Speaking of that, there's a documentary that has been held up for a long time, and here's an excerpt of it. This thing is called Trump, What's the Deal? Yes. You can buy it on YouTube for $2.95.
You'll rent it. I think you rent it for that. Buy it for about $10.
Well, I mean, you can watch it for $2.95. But here's just a little excerpt, and I want you to explain it after we see this. So what happened to the Taj Mahal, and what about this documentary?
Well, I covered all of that back then, and these were terrible deals. I wrote that they were both going to fail promptly, and they couldn't pay their bond interest, which is exactly what happened. This documentary by Libby Hendros was a terrific job of telling you who Donald Trump was. It was only shown twice, and Donald's threats of litigation shut it down. Donald has shut down many things with threats of litigation. I wrote a proposal for a Tim Burton movie about Donald Trump, and his threats of litigation meant that it never came about. Finally, Libby Hendros decided when he was running for president, I've got to put this out there. They updated it just a little bit in the opening because people need to see this. And it's 80 minutes, and it's a great, quick lesson on Donald Trump. I'd rather you buy my book, but Libby's movie is very good. This particular deal was indicative of the fact that Donald doesn't have the business skill he says he has. He cannibalized his own market. He took over this white elephant of a property, the Trump Taj Mahal. His name will now disappear on October 10th from Atlantic City because his casinos are gone. And he goes around saying that it's terrible in Atlantic City. Well, you know, there are casinos in Atlantic City this day who are making nice fat profits, above average profits for the country, for all businesses.
Why didn't he?
Because his company was terribly managed. When he had competent executives, 3 of them were killed in a helicopter crash, unfortunately. But every other case, he eventually drove out his competent executives because he was demanding and bullying and mistreated people. And if you're competent, you know, what are you going to put up with this for? You go somewhere else. And he put in place yes men. And by the way, to your earlier question, a Donald Trump administration will be full of people, many of whom you've probably never heard of, whose distinguishing characteristic will be total loyalty to Donald Trump, not to the Constitution, not to the American people, not to the long-term welfare of the country, but to Donald Trump personally.
We're running out of time, and I got a couple more names I want to bring up. Bob Libutti, is that the
Bob Libutti was the biggest loser in Atlantic City. He was a con man and a mob guy, not a made guy, but a mob associate, who I spent a lot of time with. And Donald was fined for removing black women and Asian dealers and cocktail waitresses because he thought it was currying favor with Bob, because Bob, when he was losing money, would let loose this just vile language, crazy language in many cases. And Bob Libutti, when I interviewed him, he goes, hey, I didn't know Donald was doing that. That's outrageous. I would never remove somebody. You know, I say these terrible words, but you know, I'm not the racist. Donald Trump is the racist. Bob Libutti calls you a racist. That's pretty bad.
Where is he now?
He's dead. He died a few years ago. Donald tried to seduce his daughter. And Steve Hyde, who was running the casinos, who was very competent, told Bob Libutti, who told the story to me, that you got to keep Donald away from your daughter because you're going to kill him and I'm going to lose my best customer. And Bob, as he told the story to me, went to Donald and said, after Donald had given her a cream-colored Mercedes and had a video made for her birthday and other things, that if you approach my daughter again, I will castrate you without benefit of a knife.
By the way, you mentioned in the book about his germophobia.
Yes.
But now he's shaking hands with people.
That's
what
a surprise. I don't know. That's very interesting. I actually did shake hands with Donald once a long, long time ago, and I noticed he was immediately, doing this and disappeared into the bathroom. But he's now shaking hands. I think somebody has told him it doesn't look good if you don't do that.
I'm going to let you pronounce the name Akio
Kashiwagi. Akio Kashiwagi was the biggest gambler in the world, and I'm the only journalist who watched him gamble at the rate of $14 million an hour. $200,000 a bet, 70 bets an hour. And Donald Trump lured him twice to Atlantic City. He completely mishandled this guy. He should have won $12 million off of him, and instead he lost about $6 million. And I recount in the book the story of what happened here. And Donald hired Jess Markham, who was a teenager, helped invent radar, and went on to be a co-founder of the RAND Corporation, one of the great geniuses of the last century, to watch the game because he was convinced the guy was cheating. And I recount in the story that I'm the person who figured out there was $500,000 of chips missing that nobody else noticed. And it turned out that Kashiwagi had in fact scammed him for the $500,000 worth of chips. But the story is mostly about how if Donald had understood the game of Baccarat and the math, he would have realized that there came a point when it was an 87-to-1 odds that he would wipe the guy out. And instead, he gave him an excuse to walk away from the table, and Donald lost money as a result. And that's indicative of the fact that Donald just doesn't know anything.
By the way, go back to the lawyers in this book. What did they excise from the book?
Oh, nothing was excised. There were a couple of places where we just reworded things a little bit in very minor, light editing. I've been doing this for so many years, almost 50 years now, that I know how to write things so that they're legal and they're fair.
How did you get on the New York Times bestseller list?
A lot of people bought the book.
How did they find out about it if television hasn't had you
Well,
on?
because I have a pretty good-sized Twitter following. Melville House is very good at marketing, and they were out telling people about the book. The initial orders we got from bookstores were just nothing because there are a bunch of Trump books, and my fear was what would happen to my last two bestsellers. They ran out of books. Well, that happened. A lot of bookstores ran out of books first weekend, and then they started ordering lots of books, so it's now readily available. But that was just devastating to me the first time around. I'm going up the New York Times bestseller list, and they didn't have enough books. This time, the people at Melville House have been extraordinary in their understanding of how you market a book and get people to buy it.
Was there any other title besides The Making of Donald Trump?
I wanted to call the book The Art of Deception. They didn't want to do that. That's not a neutral title, and it turns people off. I've actually had people post things on the internet because they think this is a pro-Donald Trump book. And it was designed to be neutral and to tell you what it's about. And it's essentially, where does this guy come from? Who is he? And I start with, his grandfather, who was a German draft dodger who made a fortune running whorehouses, on through Donald's development and his education, and then all of these associations that he doesn't want you to know about. And my goal was to balance Donald Trump's masterful PR image of himself with all the things Donald does not want you to know.